Good afternoon. Welcome to this conversation that we're going to have on geopolitics of technology. Now, I think it's fair to say that technology and geopolitics as two ideas were pretty much joined in the hip. I mean, if you go back to the origins of thinking about the world in geopolitical terms, to the turn of the 20th century, the entire idea of thinking of politics operating at the global scale was because of technological development around that time, right? So technology and geopolitics run pretty much through together. But at the same time, technology also brings the globe together in other ways that we understand as globalization, right? So on the one hand, technology sort of connects, it flattens out the globe, as we say, but it also creates differentials in terms of power, capability, which then drives competition. So technology is central both to globalization and to geopolitics, to competition and to cooperation. And I think it's also fair to say that competition and cooperation are not kind of mutually exclusive categories here. If you want to compete with someone, you have to cooperate with others. So those are the kinds of broad themes that we really want to explore. Over the last 8 to 10 years, the geopolitics of technology has become a lot more competitive, partly because of the advent and upsurge of new technologies. We've already spoken this morning about things like AI, semiconductors, quantum computing, cybersecurity, and so on. We also know that there are very distinct regulatory sort of systems and environments coming into place in different geographies to help develop and manage the state of affairs. We've spoken about the sort of role of the state and society and what the balance between these things is in terms of thinking. So for this particular session, what we really want to sort of focus on are questions around how countries in the current geopolitical sort of situation are balancing out technological competition with other policies, particularly around trade, which are essential to build resilience, particularly in supply chains and so on. This is not just a story of the states. We also want to understand how multinational corporations are navigating geopolitical tensions and a fragmented regulatory scheme. In a nutshell, I think what we want to understand really are what are the opportunities as much as vulnerabilities for critical tech in such a time of geopolitical flux. Sambhavna, which is the title of both this panel but also of this edition of the GTS, is about possibilities. But etymologically in Sanskrit, Sambhavna also means coming together, particularly in terms of a meeting of minds. So what we're hoping really is to pick some of the wonderful minds we have around this panel to try and develop some perspective on what really are the opportunities in this landscape. So thank you so much for joining us here today. Tarun, if I may, can I begin with you to give us a sense of one of the sort of main axes of the geopolitics of technology has been the US-China competition. You were very sort of centrally located in the Biden administration, had a ringside view of many of these developments, shaped many of the policies and so on. I just want to get a sense from you on when you look a little backwards, how do you see what was accomplished in that time? And going forward, where do you think the trend lines are pointing in this landscape of geopolitics of technology?
Thank you very much, Srinath. So I think there are a few trends that are likely to be enduring that characterize not just US-China competition in technology, but really the broader global dynamic that implicates all of us. The first I would note has to do with cybersecurity. So I think we tried to make public as much as possible some of the growing risks that we saw coming from China in cyberspace, particularly when it came to threats to our critical infrastructure and those of our friends around the world. And I think we've talked a lot about generally classes of infrastructure that we have thought about. If you think about your water and electricity and so on. But an area that we focused on that has not been, I think, focused on enough is the broader world of the Internet of Things, which could become a broader vector for cybersecurity risks. So if you think about, connected vehicles, whether they're electric or not, or you think about cloud services, or you think about industrial robotics, if this world of IoT is getting daily software updates from untrusted vendors, that really introduced profound risks for all of us. And I think we have begun to get our heads around that, but we really need to come together and work on not just standards, because standards alone don't solve a problem with a trusted vendor, but really figure out ways in which we open up our markets to one another and create a trusted zone. Because those vulnerabilities are not going away, and to date it's really only the United States that's taken action in a number of these areas, and we really need to, I think, expand the sphere of friends and partners who are doing the same. I think the second area is just kind of the broader technology and trade dynamic, and Dr. Jaishankar this morning, said it's very difficult to say, oh, this is non-sensitive trade, and this is sensitive trade now. And I think what he was talking about was, in one dimension, this world of IoT, and that could extend, quite far into things that are in our daily lives. But he's also talking about the question, I think, of overcapacity, and that gets to not just, questions about how many vehicles are coming in and so on, but it goes to the core of our national competitiveness as nations, right? To what degree can we sustain critical industries of the future with overcapacity coming online? And this is an issue that's been of concern not just for the United States, but many developing countries as well that also have ambitions to play in high technology and be advanced manufacturers as well. And then finally, I think the AI competition is very fierce. It's going to continue to be. It's going to pervade every aspect of national security, economic competitiveness, our manufacturing base, and so on, especially as more and more capable models come online. I think that means more focus on the hardware underlying, the silicon underlying frontier artificial intelligence, the power, as was referred to earlier today as well, and then whether we can come to any sort of understandings about ways in which advanced AI, advanced agents, right, could pose risks to all of us. Is it possible to come to some understanding of those risks and try to work on them together?
Thanks, Tarun. I'm sure we'll pick up some of those points when we get around next. Jon, if I could turn to you next. The European Union and Europe more broadly and the United States have had quite distinctive paths towards regulating technology, thinking about how do you want to sort of promote innovation and use and so on. But the current geopolitical context, I think, has particularly been, the transatlantic relationships have been a major focal point of many of the changes that seem to be unfolding pretty rapidly, even as we meet here. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how does this kind of geopolitical flux impinge upon Europe's approach towards thinking about technology, not just in the European context, but more globally as well?
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this. I think I would talk about a couple of things. The regulation and the approach that the EU uses in comparison to the US and why we have a certain approach, and also the need for speed. And relating to that, okay, how, if technology develops so fast, okay, how does governance need to develop to certify that we accomplish the benefits that we strive for, but also to handling the risks? But my background, I was an entrepreneur for 15 years, and then 10 years ago I shifted into government. As an entrepreneur, you know that speed is basically everything. But in an EU context, both the businesses and the citizens, they don't tolerate too much of mistakes. So if things are not, in healthcare, for example, with data sharing or with integrity issues, our citizens are not so tolerant. In the US, you solve things with the judicial way, but we don't. We have a contract between the citizen and the government to protect us and do good things for us. So then that then leads to that we need to regulate in a bit more advanced, so we can really ensure that the developments of AI or drones or automatic vehicles or machines in the forest or in the farming are run in a way and handled in a way that the citizens approve of. And as a consequence, then we end up with a lot of regulation. But then the trick is, and I think EU is actually on this pretty well, that you have to look at regulation as a dynamic matter. And when EU defines new regulation, many times they write into this regulation that they should be revised, for example, within a couple of years. So if you look at regulation as a cyclical process, you can curb a bit of the difficulties with over-regulation. So that's, I think, very, very important. And I think actually EU is better than many nations in Europe to handle that type of thinking. And another dimension is that it's so easy to regulate with very hard instruments, laws and regulations, but you have to look at the complete threshold of regulations, from soft regulations, industry, common understanding of problems, industry, maybe industry agreements, up to standardization, and then to tough regulation. And you have to play on the whole ladder of regulation. And I think Europe could be much better to use the whole stack of different types of ways of regulating and normating different areas. So that's one thing then. But now when I talk to entrepreneurs and also companies and also the public sector healthcare providers, they actually see that they want to use tech in a very, very rapid manner. But it's actually, the challenges, for example, with GDPR that really makes it difficult. So somehow the public sector has to facilitate a more rapid technology development. And how do we do that then? If you look up, now ramping up the EU defense production, for example, the companies are ready there, they have the finances, they have the customers, but to build all these new things requires a lot of permitting. And that's actually quite complex in Europe. To build a new power grid line or a new regiment or whatever is extremely complex. So a lot of these challenges with new technology or automatic drones for farming or in the forest industry falls back on the regulators and the governments to facilitate this more rapid development. So it actually goes to the politicians and the civil servant to enable a safe and rapid deployment of new technology. And that's the European approach, and that's what we're striving for. It will not be an easy path, but that's the approach we have to deploy.
Devjani, if I could bring you into the conversation now. We just heard from Nandan Nilekani a little while ago about, how he sees the development of AI in the context of India. But I'm just wondering from your vantage point, what really is the AI opportunity for India in this kind of a landscape, which is clearly both unpredictable, fragmented, but also perhaps throws up various kinds of opportunities?
Thanks, Sriram. I think if you ask all five of us to summarize what we think is the current situation, the global situation in AI, I think you'll get five very different answers. And I think we're at that stage where there's very little, frankly, understanding and agreement in terms of what is really happening and where this is going to go. The things that we do know is the pace of evolution is something we have never experienced before, the pace at which things are changing. What we do know is that the rules of competition are completely being rewritten. And they're pretty much being rewritten every time China comes up with a new model or someone comes up with something else, we all go back to the playbook to say, oh my God, how did this happen? What changed? So I still believe we're in very early days. And the competition and how this will play out and the rules especially are going to change pretty drastically over the next maybe few years. So I think this is the perfect time, rather than, of course you have to worry about today and what's happening today, but this is the perfect time to get into the art of possibility thinking and figure out where do you want to be tomorrow and how do you shape that future. And that's my day job at Niti Aayog, which is the Frontier Tech Hub. That's what we do. And as we look at the AI opportunities, the lens I'm applying to it is, what should this mean for us in the next 10 years? Where should India be in the next 10 years in order to not just count, but shape the trajectory of AI, both from an innovation perspective as well as from an application perspective. And we've been thinking through this for the last few months, many months, and there are three things that I think is a must-do for India to fully leverage the AI opportunity. First, we have to pick very strategic sectors and think of it from a supply chain perspective. Where do we want to disrupt? Where do we want to get more control? And we have to figure out how do we disrupt the rules of competition through R&D, R&D, and R&D. Really have to double down on R&D. And if I have to pick 3 areas that India should prioritize under this, the first one would be what I call life tech. This is AI, biology, sensors sort of coming together. And I think this is going to completely revolutionize the way we think of healthcare, the way we think of agriculture, environment, etc. I think it's going to be a way bigger opportunity than what we even know of AI by now. The second area would be advanced materials. All the news coming out of China pretty much daily and how they're disrupting, changing the lane as they call it in semicon, et cetera, et cetera. This is going to be critical for us, especially India's dependence on manufacturing sector and the need to grow that sector. Semicon. Catching up is going to be a very difficult strategy. But disruption, I think, is going to be the way to go forward in areas like semicon. And the way to disrupt is, I think one of the ways to disrupt is going to be metamaterials, to figure out what's next, right? And India has to invest in this. And the third area I would invest in is quantum computing and communications. I think this is going to be absolutely critical in terms of how it defines security, national security, and also compute. So that's my first block, which is prioritizing some 3 supply chains and then figuring out true, really world-class R&D disruption, how do we change the rules of competition. The second one for me is make renewable energy a strategic and competitive advantage for India. We have to be the source code for the most affordable and clean energy in the world. And how do we get there? And what do we have to do today? What do we have to invest in to ensure that we get there in the next 10 years? China is ahead of us, so again, we have to think of a disruptive strategy. But if there is one thing that will challenge the efficiency of controls, export controls, I think who has the energy and who controls the energy supply chain is going to be one of the key things that will challenge that. And I think we are on a good ground to think of a leapfrog strategy in this one. So this is another big opportunity for me. And the third one is we have to bring back human accountability and human focus in the game of AI. We are currently completely moving away from it. When you think of the tech framework, what we are seeing come out of a lot of big tech and West is technology is in the center. So yes, we want to race towards AGI, but none of these companies can today stand up and say what they really mean by AGI. And there are different versions of it. So if AGI is going to help us, great, then let's build it. But if it is not, and the story is then why are we building? Why are we investing so much of our dollars into this? And I think you have to now figure out a framework which has the human and the planet's well-being at the center. And that's the human-centric model. And India, I think, is tremendously well-placed to drive that thinking. Everything we have done evolves around human centricity. So these are the 3 things I think India should prioritize and really focus on, not just to disrupt, but also to lead and shape the trajectory, the narrative, the standards that's going to define this.
Great, thanks. Brendan, if you could bring in an Australia sort of perspective to this discussion. You've been very closely involved in thinking about issues at the nexus of security and technology, particularly in terms of creating resilience across domains and so on. So I'm just wondering, again, I mean, does the current sort of geopolitical moment call for new ways of thinking about what that relationship amounted to? Are there continuities from what you've done in the past that you would like to sort of, press forward, taking others? What can other partners of Australia do in this domain?
I think your initial point about technology and global power always being connected is actually very spot on. But we convinced ourselves in the digital age that this time was different. And I think if we go back to the late 90s and the 2000s, an air gap developed between geopolitics and policy making and technology and innovation. And I think in the technology industry, this idea gained a lot of currency that This was a new phase of human technology. This was a new phase of human interactions, and the old world ways of geopolitics and power didn't apply, and that the digital world was somehow inoculated from those new ways. And some of those, we'll recall some of those statements made by tech evangelists at the time have really not stood up well to scrutiny 25 years later. But on the government side, I think we also failed. We bought into the idea that tech was too complicated, was too technical, moved too fast, and that as policymakers, as bureaucracies, we couldn't possibly develop suitable policy and governance and regulation for this new world of digital technology. I think for the last 5 to 10 years, we've been trying to correct that mistake and recognise that actually technology is a domain in which the old world trends play out just as much. Technology is a domain where the public interest is at stake, and governments therefore have an obligation to their people to act in the national and public interest in the way technology is deployed and developed. In Australia, I think the approach we've taken for about 8 years now is to better intertwine the policy-making process with the technology development deployment process. A lot of the time that means working in partnership with major technology players, but sometimes it means imposing legislation and regulation to say that we need to create requirements and mandates on the technology industry that better reflect the geopolitical circumstances. For anyone who doubts how relevant technology is to geopolitics, you only have to look at how Russia has used cyber tools as a part of its campaign against Ukraine. You only have to look at the way North Korea has effectively funded its ballistics and nuclear missiles, nuclear warfare program through the theft of cryptocurrency. In Australia, 10 million Australians had their sensitive information accessed by cyber criminals operating out of Russia. And in the Pacific, we've seen some of the smallest nations in the world, nations with only tens of thousands of people, hit by cyber attacks emanating globally. So technology and geopolitics are deeply intertwined. I think for this audience, that's an obvious point, it's axiomatic, but when you take that out into broader policy-making circles, it's actually not accepted. And policymakers who talk about geopolitics don't talk about technology, and those who talk about technology don't talk about geopolitics. So that gap is real and it remains. What comes next, I think this is a time where we will make very consequential decisions. We have to make decisions about if we're introducing foundational tech to our nations, if that is a vector for a foreign attack, foreign interference, foreign disruption, then it is well within, and it is in fact an expectation of governments that we will put limitations on to better protect our people. I think Tarun's point around IoT is incredibly compelling. IoT, industrial IoT, is throughout every aspect of our societies, and yet is a point of vulnerability. We are allowing states that would misuse that access, that technology power into every aspect of our lives and our economy. So it's incumbent on us to be more active in engaging in the technology and geopolitics conversation. It's an international partnership that we have to engage in. Australia has not only invested in building up our national resilience, but we've made it one of our major foreign policy priorities to build the stability and security of the region on a foundation of secure, trusted technology. This is something that is increasingly going to be part of all of our toolkits and is a priority for us.
Thanks. Sebastian, if we could turn the focus a little bit towards the industry and business outlook, not just on what is happening by way of geopolitical sort of flux, but I think there are competing imperatives in place that, on the one hand, you need global technology development, but there are pressures towards localization, nationalization, regionalization of these kinds of things. So from a business vantage point, how do you sort of balance these imperatives of, on the one hand, needing to sort of do things across different geographies, but then having particular sort of pressures in particular areas? And so.
No, thank you. He's given me the easy question, you could tell. Look, it's a real honor to be part of this conversation at a very defining moment and a real inflection point, not only for technology and where agentic AI and other solutions are evolving, but obviously in terms of global dynamics. I think I'd start in answering your question, though, to share a little bit the vantage point, right? Sort of that, I come at this, that we come at this. I help lead Salesforce as president and chief legal officer. We're a global technology platform that serves, across sectors, across countries, across governments, and the like. And this includes our agentic AI platform, Agentforce, that is really kind of driving, across a whole set of different, cases and contexts, really the vision of humans and digital labor, right? Humans with agents and AI coming together to try to drive and define different sets of stakeholder, success, closing capacity gaps, transforming, enterprises and outcomes, and the like. And so with that, geopolitics, right, is not theoretical, right? It's a reality that all of our customers are grappling with, every day. And we often kind of operate as trusted advisors to these different industries, and governments and contexts. With that, I would note this is both energizing and very hard work, right? And sort of why, right? Well, anyone sort of here listening, today, whether you're in the room, right, sort of, or, globally on the live stream, what is it that every country wants, right? Every country wants resilience, right, and success, right, for their peoples. Every company, right, wants to innovate responsibly and transform, right, effectively and fundamentally. And what does every citizen want? Every citizen wants to know that they will not be left behind. I think I'm encouraged, actually around some of these issues right now because these conversations, right, are now happening across borders, across sectors. And the fundamental opportunity will remain that if we put trust, inclusion, and impact at the center of how and where we not just deploy technology, but define the future around AI, and impact, we can do something really remarkable working together, whether that's private and public sector collaboration, whether it's industries, right, sort of working across to sort of serve the needs of their constituents and their stakeholders, and governments doing the same. And what is it that's going to be remarkable? Well, you will be deploying technology, not sort of like AI for AI's sake, but to drive the real outcomes that make a difference so that you have technology that's not just powerful, but principled. And so how do you navigate this sort of new kind of evolving environment? It actually comes down to the fundamentals, right? Which is for Salesforce, we have our 5 core values that drive how we think about this. Trust, customer success, innovation, equality, and sustainability. And when we work with governments, customers, and sort of other contexts across this, it's, well, how do we help each other succeed? How do we help customers succeed? How do we promote interoperability, right? How do we, yes, have a global vision, global platform, global priorities, but also really respect regional and local, differences, and needs? Because whether it's, having cross-border, right, data flows, whether it's figuring out, that the reality is, look, everyone wants to be self-reliant. But to be really successful, we all know you can't be isolated. And to solve the problems that are before us and also seize what's been noted, this intersection, right, of national competitiveness, right, of public trust, of global opportunity and risks, it's all intersecting and it's either aligning or colliding, right? And technology plays a fundamental role in this, but the policies and standards that we choose to implement or that we refrain from implementing because we want to have the right common sense context that drive responsible innovation, but actually drive with that bias for responsible action comment that you heard earlier. I think that really has to be the imperative. And we need to move forward on this, yes, with speed, yes, with scale, but really in trust.
Anthony, if I could sort of focus the same question a little bit more on the AI side of things and talk a little bit about how the AI economy is evolving across geographies. I'm particularly interested to understand from your vantage point, what do you see as the sort of principal opportunities for collaboration in an environment like this?
Yeah, firstly, it's wonderful to be here. I think this is a really important moment, as has been said, and I think the AI moment in particular, I think, is incredibly important because in some senses, the gap that Brendan was referring to that opened up in relation to, I think, policymaking and technology has been really found probably its highest focus in AI, partly because the development of AI has largely sat, unlike a lot of other technologies, primarily with the private sector. And as a consequence, the sort of some of the ethos that I think pervaded some technology companies in the the earlier 2000s related to we should self-regulate has come into this focus where actually governments recognize that if the technology is, one, going to be innovated in the most ways that meet some of the requirements that we've heard across the panel about doing so in ways that will respect security interests, they will respect domestic interests from whether they're like in the European Union that are sort of starting from a values-based protection perspective. Those are things where I think the dialogue has moved, and so companies are now having to realize in order to build the very trust that Sebastian was talking about, the notion that you can simply say, leave us and we'll do what we want to do and we can proceed without the interaction and engagement with government is just not acceptable. And so then I think you see that conversation evolving very differently in different places around the world. In some places, and the EU has been at the forefront of this in the sense of the AI Act there, remembering that the AI Act really originated before the generative AI moment in a sense. And so the Europeans were progressing down a path of setting out the framework for engagement and a dialogue with industry very much about that. But as the AI moment came, the recognition that there was a safety first approach in Turkey, looking at sort of a risk categorization of AI and how we would start to engage in doing that. And I think one of the things that's been very interesting in the regulation as it's come out is some of the focus on codes of conduct that are then being developed, in much closer relationship with industry to inform, both so that industry understands what's coming, as well as informing the way in which the regulation is going to unfold. And so I do think as you look around the world, the way in which that sort of dynamic between the government and players in the IT industry are forming is evolving in different ways. I think if you look in Asia, there is a sort of predominant innovation first step being taken, but very much I think informed, and India is a great example, and some of the organisations that have been on stage already, where that dialogue between public and private to inform the decision making and to inform the way that regulation is going to be pushed forward to identify where there are public interests that the technology should be focused on, I think are going to be very important. The final thing that I would probably say is, as you then think about, from our perspective, and you look at this, the geopolitical intersection, if you like, with technology, one of the things that's very important to Microsoft, in fact, it's part of our mission, is how do you empower organizations? And I do think that, one of the things that we think about very much is as you look at the technology layers, and particularly in AI, you look at both what the foundation levels are, you look at the building of models, you look at then the application layer is, how do you make sure that you're building partnerships across all of those levels? Because ultimately politics is always local. And so you have to work out the ways in which you can engage with local partners across the different levels of the IT infrastructure. And one of the things that we've thought a lot about is how do you make sure that open source thrives on our platform? How do you make sure that we have models so that people can go to market and they can choose the way that they are able to do that without constraining them to a particular marketplace definition? And I think those are very important steps if you're going to move beyond sort of proprietary solutions and companies defining regulation for themselves, and you really want to provide an open environment where people can then come in, build the solutions they need to, leverage the technology and the innovation that's on the platform, and yet meet some of the final needs. And the final thing I would say is on this conversation at the moment, I think around the importance of local and sort of domestic interests, and therefore the sovereign conversation, is I think the one that's just so important, because we're seeing this is a pressure that's arising primarily, as a consequence and in response to some of the US activity over the last sort of, particularly the last 3 to 4 months, but reflecting a little bit, even on the last administration as well. And I think one of the things that's very important in that dialogue is how are there going to be partnerships between local players and global providers in order to build the sort of the trust that we're talking about, to make sure that the benefits that everybody sees from the technology are not going to be stamped out by a move to sort of pure isolationism in the way that technology operates, which I don't think we'll see the full fruition of what it offers.
Tarun, if I could pick you up on exactly this point, right? I mean, my understanding is that one of the things that you were very focused on while in office was how do you build partnerships in order to sort of create resilience around critical technology and so on. But does the current turn, towards kind of more widespread tariffs, a sense that partners have to prove their worth, etc., create new kinds of challenges for how this, business of ensuring resilience of critical supplies, etc., is going to be done?
So you're right about our approach. Our approach was to deepen partnerships with countries like India, with Japan and Korea, the European Union, Vietnam, and other partners. And part of that is a recognition that China has scale. China has tremendous scale. China's and not approaching, in most cases, the world in that kind of spirit of partnership necessarily. It's a very different approach. And we saw a tremendous opportunity to capitalize on both leader-level interest in technology as a strategic issue, but also just the public imagination, right? And interest in technology improving the lives of all citizens. And so that was a major focus in the administration. Now, going forward, I still remain optimistic in the spirit of this gathering that where things could go is over the next few months, you end up with negotiations happening, taking advantage of the approach that I think Dr. Jaishankar laid out today, which is an opportunity to reset the trade relationship between the United States and India, and that at the end of it, we can continue to deepen some of these partnerships as the administration has laid out the intention of doing with trust as a U.S.-India initiative, and that we just continue to recognize the systemic challenge that China continues to pose, and we already see that now with the relative tariff rates, and we also see that in the way that China is responding, right, which is, I think, kind of further trying to embark on this path of dual circulation, right, which is try to make the rest of the world more dependent on China, but make itself less dependent on others, and weaponizing supply chains like critical minerals and so on. So I still have some optimism that is the general direction we can continue to go.
Devjani, on the China sort of point, you pointed out that China is well ahead of India in the renewable sort of energy technology space. Now, my understanding is that China is not just ahead of India, but ahead of practically the rest of the world, and then by a very considerable distance in certain kind of areas of this thing. Now, there is clearly a global imperative in the context of climate change for wanting a quick kind of transition towards alternatives as part of an energy mix and so on. Given that imperative, how easy or difficult is it going to be to resist what China has to offer, especially at the scale at which things seems to be offering? So when you say that India wants to leapfrog, I mean, what time scale are we really conceiving that we can make such a move because the rest of the world needs to do some of that stuff. And if the Chinese are going to make that available, and as Tarun says, they're happy to sort of have this kind of dual circulation model where you increase dependency in certain ways in order to benefit your own domestic, suppliers and so on. What really is the time frame within which India needs to act, and how are we going to get our act together?
Two good things, right? One, the demand for energy is never going to stop. It's going to continue to grow. So, you haven't missed the bus if you sort of if you need to take a few years to get your strategy and playbook right? Because the demand for energy is just going to grow and grow and grow. So, and the other good thing is this is an infinite game that we are playing. The tech game is there are no goalposts. There's no finishing line. So for me, it's not so important in terms of where you are in the race right now. What is much more important is what are you doing to get ahead, right? At least the work that we are doing to futurecast India and where it needs to be, we're taking a 10-year horizon, because the kind of foundational changes that is required to do a lot of things is not going to happen in a year or 2 years. There are three ways to look at it. There's enough incremental changes you can make on what exists today, the current base, the current strengths, to get some advantage. And then comes the breakthroughs, right? And in breakthroughs, there's, we are categorizing it in what are the breakthroughs we must get in the next 5 years? What are the breakthroughs you must get in the next 10 years? So I think that's how you have to really look at this game. I think fundamentally, Sriram, it ultimately comes down to what will it take us and how long will it take us to make India a world-class research and development hub. Ultimately, no matter how you cut it, no matter which layers you peel, it'll come back to R&D. And I think that was the DeepSeek realization for the world, right? It wasn't about, I don't believe the amount that was called out, but still, I think what was clear is this is not about deep pockets. This is not about legacy. This is about pure R&D and R&D brilliance. I mean, Google came out with distillation techniques, but DeepSeek showed us what it can do, right? So this was really about the brilliance of R&D. And I think that's what we have to build in India. And whether it takes us 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, so be it. But we have to build it really well, because once you have that foundation, then the opportunities are pretty much endless. And again, as I said, the timing is not that important. Everything we have today is just going to grow, and it's going to grow more complex. Yeah.
Yeah, and my impression is that the government is already trying to catalyze investment in R&D through various kinds of schemes. I mean, they've put a huge outlay, unprecedented, right? I mean, so.
That's what I said, break down the framework, right? There's one, which is what do we have today, and how do we put it to work in the most efficient way? And that's where ministries like, departments like DST, etc., are doing a fabulous job, ANRF, coming out with these initiatives. That's what will strengthen the base today. But I think it's also important to figure out what are the breakthroughs that are needed, which may take a little bit more time, but we have time, and we have to figure out what are those, right? But if I may, I just want to add to the point about partnerships on AI, and you talked about, and Tarun, you talked about. One of the big things that came out of US just before the administration change was the AI Diffusion Act, right? And I don't know if you'll call it about partnerships, but even if it is pretty much breaking down partners by trust, right? In terms of who you trust and how much, and therefore. And I think these are things which we have to do immediately. Like, we are the only Quad country in Tier 2. Why? And I think the administration change opens the door to go back and renegotiate some of these to figure out what is needed to create a win-win situation, right? So partnerships are going to be very important, but it has to be partnerships that are win-win, that's important to both sides and on equal footing. So I think that's what we have to really start looking at.
Got it. Before we open up to questions from the floor, I just wanted to pick up, perhaps Jan and Brendan, you could come in on this, on sort of, frontier technology for military applications. I mean, Jan, you spoke about startups in the context of Europe, catalyzed obviously by the Ukraine war, but there has been a tremendous growth. But at the same time, you need a regulatory framework. You also need some kind of an export strategy, because at the end of the day, and then to whom do you export? What kinds of countries are you willing to partner with? I mean, is there already some thinking along those lines? And Brendan, perhaps you could talk a little bit on the cybersecurity sort of dimension of this as well. I mean, how do we think about partnerships, in a geopolitical sense when we are wanting to sort of share these technologies and so on? Jon, do you want to get us started? Yeah.
Maybe I could start a bit, yeah. This is about export focus and de-risking and collaboration. As an entrepreneur, you always have to bring in the best solutions. You have to do the best things, otherwise you will not be successful on the global marketplace. So somehow that is a compromise. And de-risking, if you want to do that, it costs money, and the governments have to be aware of that. I mentioned to some people that of the rare earth metals, there are 17 of those, and 10 of those were discovered in Sweden. And up in northern parts of Sweden, there's residue from iron ore with a lot of rare earth metals, but it costs money to start exploring and processing those, but it's possible. But de-risking that area costs money, and then we have to have models to handle that somehow. So how do we do that? It's not so easy. One thing I was thinking about as well is this with, you were talking about trust and responsibility. One curious thing in Sweden is that the most trusted public entity is the tax agency. And that might be pretty counterintuitive, but it depends. They have built, it's actually a small story, where three stonemasons that were cutting stone, and a merchant passed by, and the first stonecutter said, "I'm cutting square stones." And the second stonemason said, I work here to provide for my family. And the third stonecutter said, I'm building a temple. And the thing is that you have to apply these three perspectives. The first perspective, inside-out perspective, running technology as a very efficient way of doing your stuff. The second perspective is, okay, do good things for your citizens, for the community, and for the companies. So you have to have an outside-in perspective on yourself. And why the tax agency is so popular is they have built that trust, and now you can do income declarations with one push button in Sweden. And now they're moving on to this holistic approach, building the temple. And then you really have to look at the holistic perspective. Okay, how do we share data? How do we share data to counter criminality, for example? So then you have to move into that perspective. But the problem is then that, okay, how do we govern agencies or companies so they apply the inside-out perspective, the outside-in perspective, and the holistic perspective at the same time? And that's a big challenge, but that is very much required to get the technology development and implementation to run very, very rapidly, to have that holistic approach somehow.
Thank you. Look, I think the era of ubiquitous digital technologies, the cyber era that we live in, is materially different for our national security. The front line of defence against cyber attacks, whether it's nation state, whether it's non-state actors in Australia, who's at that front line? It's Microsoft. You know, we saw with the CrowdStrike technical outage. I apologise for bringing that up. I hope I don't trigger you, Anthony. 1% of Microsoft devices affected globally, and that shut down huge amounts of functioning. If Microsoft was to fail at its mission of protecting and continuing our economic activity, our infrastructure functioning, that would lead to Australian society stopping to function like that. So our old ideas of how we approach national security, government-to-government conversations are no longer adequate in a situation where the private sector is actually at the front line of our national security. So we need to get much more deeper, much more intimate in our relationships with the private sector. We need to open up from a government perspective about the type of information that enables private sector companies, infrastructure operators to do their job at protecting their systems. And we also need the private sector to be open with government about the type of threats that they're seeing and what they're doing to protect it. I also think the digital age has changed the notion of international partnerships. We need to work with a much broader range of partners. Part of what I've been doing in India this week is looking at how we can really enhance our strategic technology work with India. India is a major technology power. It produces technology on which the Indo-Pacific region depends. We need a strong partnership with India so that we have that technology being built in a secure and safe manner. We also recognise India is a regional power, so sharing information about the cyber threats that we're both facing is crucial. And we need, as a global community, a broader global community, not just the EU, not just the Five Eyes, to stand up and say what is acceptable in cyberspace, that attacks on civilian critical infrastructure are not acceptable, and that we stand up as a global community to say there are rules, international law applies in cyberspace, and we need to hold those rules firm. So for me, the partnerships, the private sector approach needs to be substantially different to previous eras.
If I may quickly just on this point. Look, so I think if we're sort of speaking frankly and taking a global view, countries around the world still have varying views on what is the role of the private sector. What is the role of business? What's the role of capitalism? We can kind of go on and on around it. I think though fundamentally going forward, business needs to increasingly just embrace that business needs to find a way at scale to earn the trust of, right, all these different countries, right, all these different sort of citizenries, and really figure out how to do that, partnering with the right, set of governments, and demonstrate that the purpose of business is to solve problems, right? Problems of people, problems of planet, problems of other businesses, problems of countries. And that has to be part of the solution so that you have, right, trust first, enterprise grade, enterprise ready, systems that are both going to deliver the security, right, and safety that's needed, but also fundamentally drive the innovation that is fundamental to solving all of the problems that have existed for a very, very long time. These things have to come together if you want to close all these different set of digital divides. And the digital divides of the future will not just be about access, but as was noted, it's going to be about trust.
Okay, I think we can take a couple of questions from the floor. I think we had a question right here in the front. Sorry, can you get the mic here? Okay, to that gentleman, and then here, please.
Thank you.
We'll take two questions at a time, and then...
Yeah, question to Devjani about making India an R&D hub. When I did my PhD around 5 years back, you can correct me if I'm wrong, most of the PhDs with Indian universities are on esoteric subjects, public policy, history, international relations. We don't have an MTech in metallurgy, semiconductor design. How is it the update on this? How is it going to change? So maybe we will have our own engine which can drive a fighter aircraft, we don't have one, which can drive a ship, we don't have one, which can drive a battlefield tank, we don't have one. So what is the update on this, please?
As Professor of History and International Relations, I'm very interested to see what you have to say. Sorry, can we just get the mic here, please? We have one more question, and then the lady in front, please. Yeah. And then we can maybe take one more question and then answer all three. Yeah.
My name is Heli-Dirma Klaar, and I am a cyber expert from Estonia. So one of the topics that was not really discussed at this panel is resource called talent. In Europe, many countries haven't digitalized properly because they also lack the talent, and we are short of 500,000 to 1 million IT cyber experts in Europe, and probably the number is even bigger in other tech areas. So we know that India doesn't have that problem, and therefore India probably will be the global winner in the future because Chinese population will decrease over the years as there are those statistics. So I'm just wondering, probably it doesn't concern the Microsoft or large companies in this world because you will always find the talent. But I think when we are talking about especially maybe European-India cooperation and the talent and mobility that was discussed in the morning is an interesting topic for us in Europe, and also how the current US immigration policy might affect the US competitiveness in this field in long run is a question. And my question to Indian participants here is that what is Indian government doing in order to grow the talent and in order to maybe, I don't know, make sure that all these universities exist in all parts of in India and you will have the STEMs prioritized here. So,
okay,
thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take one last question from the gentleman there and then...
Thank you. My question really is about the geopolitics. If today geopolitics actually is characterized by deepening distrust, and technology actually is seen both as an instrument of strategic power and of commercial power, how do we expect, to the entire panel, the trajectory of technology is going to grow. I mean, the best example was given by Ms. Ghosh about the Biden administration's policy, where India is in tier 2 and Canada actually is in tier 1. So seeing the volatility of the relations, what kind of trajectory we're expecting? Forget about the global governance, regulation, so on and so forth, the trajectory of the growth of technology. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we have all of 30 seconds to answer these questions. So Devjani, I'm going to turn to you for the ones.
I'll take 1 second for R&D because I think that's a very, very important question. I'll tell you how we are looking at it, and from a Niti Frontier Tech Hub perspective. I think what is needed is not change but transformation of that sector. And when I mean, you know this better than me, when you're thinking of transformation, you have to start with the future vision. You can't transform something seeing what is today and what are the shortcomings. That's the gap analysis you anyway have to do. So the approach we are taking is, and I don't know if you've seen the paper we just released on the learnings from China, because whatever we say, there are some fantastic learnings from China that we need to look at. Accountability and execution, flawless execution are two. But one of the things we are trying to do is figure out what should be India's 10-year R&D vision. What is the goal we want to set for ourselves? And then what are the reforms that are required to make that happen? So that's the approach we are taking. Wish us luck. May the force be with us. We'll see how that goes. But it has to be forward-looking.
Can I just one quick point I wanted to add, because I think the R&D approach that's being taken in India is super thoughtful, and I think it's creating this acceleration. I think though that one of the other things to not lose sight of in that is when you have a technology like a general purpose technology like AI, the economic benefit is going to come in how it can be diffused across the whole of society. And so really remembering that yes, the R&D to build it here is important, but perhaps where all the economic value is going to come is in how is it distributed, which comes to the talent point and the education point, and it also becomes to where India has a great strength in how is an application level built on top of the platform in order to actually relieve or recognize the economic benefit.
Yeah, sure. Tarun, do you want to take the last question, which is about the broad sort of thing, and perhaps talk a little bit about India and the tiering of technology partnerships and so on?
Yeah, so just on talent, I think, we actually took as many actions as we could take within the limits of our authority to expand access to high-skilled talent, actually, but further action is required by the Congress, and I think the new administration will have to determine whether, and you saw some of these debates kind of appear during the transition about high-skilled talent coming to the United States. I think the process on leading to the diffusion rule took a few years off of my life, but I won't share, my personal views on it now as a private citizen I won't get into, but I think a lot of you could probably guess what they are, about what direction we should go with respect to China and with India. But I will say, I think the most important thing is to understand what the motivation was, which was really to prevent the offshoring of critical training infrastructure to countries that really have unlimited money and energy, and could really foment just the rapid offshoring across U.S. companies if unchecked. And then second, to address the China problem, both remote access to compute and trafficking in chips. And beyond that, I think we were very keen to make sure that what we put forth would not actually stifle partnerships with key countries as a practical matter.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for being such a wonderful panel. I think it was a fascinating discussion, Saib.